Long before the mighty empires of Persia, Greece, and Rome carved their names into history, another power was already rewriting the rules of war. Its name was Assyria. For centuries, the lands of the ancient Near East had been locked in an endless cycle of conflict. Kingdoms rose only to collapse beneath the weight of invasion. Cities were burned to ashes, trade routes disappeared beneath the dust of war, and entire civilizations struggled simply to survive. But deep in northern Mesopotamia, along the fertile banks of the Tigris River, a hardened people refused to disappear. They had endured famine. They had survived invasions. They had watched powerful neighbors rise and fall around them. Every hardship became another lesson. Every defeat became another reason to grow stronger. The Assyrians were no strangers to war. They had learned that survival belonged not to the kind or the merciful, but to the strongest. As the 10th century BCE drew to a close, the ancient world was changing. Old powers that had once dominated the region were weakening. Internal rebellions, economic decline, and relentless attacks from rival kingdoms left vast territories vulnerable. A dangerous power vacuum had opened across the Near East. For ambitious rulers, it was an opportunity unlike any before. Then in 911 BCE, a determined king ascended the Assyrian throne, Adad-nirari-Sekhu. He inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies. To the north, fierce mountain tribes threatened Assyria's borders. To the west, Aramean kingdoms challenged its authority. To the south, Babylon remained a powerful rival. Every frontier was a battlefield waiting to erupt. Many believed Assyria would eventually be swallowed by its enemies. Instead, the opposite happened. Adad-nirari II launched relentless military campaigns to reclaim lost territories. His armies marched with discipline, striking enemy strongholds one after another. Fortresses fell, rebel leaders surrendered. Border regions that had been lost for generations were brought back under Assyrian control. Each victory strengthened the kingdom. Each conquest filled its treasury with wealth, livestock, weapons, and prisoners. But these early campaigns were only the beginning. The kings who followed would transform Assyria into something the world had never seen before, a machine of conquest driven by iron discipline, military innovation, and absolute power. The Assyrians did not simply fight wars, they perfected them. Their soldiers trained year-round, while many neighboring kingdoms relied on temporary militias. Their engineers developed advanced siege machines capable of smashing through walls once thought impossible to breach. Their commanders coordinated massive armies across vast distances with astonishing efficiency. Soon, whispers of the Assyrians spread from one kingdom to another. Merchants carried terrifying stories along the trade routes. Travelers spoke of cities that surrendered without a fight after hearing the Assyrian army was approaching. Kings reinforced their walls and prayed that the black banners of Assyria would never appear on the horizon. But fear itself was becoming one of Assyria's greatest weapons. The empire had not yet reached its greatest heights. Its most famous kings had not yet taken the throne. Its greatest victories and its darkest acts still lay ahead. The sleeping giant had awakened, and before long, the ancient world would learn that resisting Assyria often meant choosing between surrender or destruction. Empires are not built in a single lifetime. They are forged by generations of rulers willing to risk everything for power. For Assyria, every king inherited more than a throne. He inherited an endless war. The expectation was simple: expand the kingdom, crush its enemies, and bring glory to the god Ashur. Failure was not an option. After the victories of Adad-nirari II, his successors continued the march of conquest. One by one, neighboring kingdoms were forced to submit. Fortresses that had resisted for decades fell beneath Assyrian assaults, and the borders of the kingdom steadily pushed outward. Then came a ruler whose name would become synonymous with fear: Ashurbanipal. When he became king in 883 BCE, he had no intention of merely defending Assyria. He intended to make every neighboring ruler fear the very mention of its name. His armies swept across the Near East with ruthless efficiency, Rebellious cities that refused to surrender were surrounded, their walls battered day and night until they finally collapsed. Once the defenses were breached, heavily armed Assyrian soldiers poured through the gaps like a flood, overwhelming exhausted defenders in brutal street fighting. For those who resisted, the punishment was meant to send a message. The king ordered harsh reprisals against rebel leaders, while surviving populations were often deported to distant regions of the empire. These actions were not random outbursts of violence. They were calculated displays of power, designed to discourage future rebellions and convince other cities that resistance came at a terrible cost. The stories spread rapidly. Merchants carried them across deserts. Travelers whispered them in crowded marketplaces. Kings heard them inside their royal palaces. Some cities chose to surrender before an Assyrian soldier even arrived, hoping mercy would spare them from destruction. Fear had become one of Assyria's most effective weapons. Yet Ashurbanipal too understood that conquest alone could not sustain an empire. He transformed the city of Nimrud into a magnificent royal capital. Enormous palaces rose from the earth, decorated with intricate stone reliefs depicting victorious campaigns, royal ceremonies, and dramatic lion hunts. At every entrance stood colossal winged guardian figures with the bodies of bulls, the wings of eagles, and the faces of men, symbols meant to project strength and divine protection. Foreign ambassadors entered these halls in awe. Everything around them proclaimed a single message. Assyria was unstoppable. The empire continued to expand under Shalmaneser III, who launched campaign after campaign across Syria and beyond. Massive armies marched farther than any Assyrian force before them, crossing rivers, climbing mountains, and laying siege to fortified cities. Some battles lasted only hours. Others dragged on for weeks as siege towers rolled toward towering walls. Archers filled the sky with arrows, and battering rams thundered against massive gates. Every victory added new lands, fresh wealth, and countless prisoners to the empire. Gold, silver, horses, timber, livestock, and precious goods flowed into Assyria from every conquered kingdom. The empire grew richer with each campaign, funding even larger armies and more ambitious invasions. It seemed as though nothing could stop its rise. But behind every victory stood an important lesson the Assyrians had mastered. Winning a battle was not enough. To rule an empire, your enemies had to believe that resistance itself was hopeless. That belief would soon be reinforced by an army unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. An army whose discipline, technology, and relentless tactics would change warfare forever. The age of the Assyrian war machine was about to begin. As the sun rose above the horizon, a dark cloud appeared in the distance. At first it looked like a gathering storm. Then the earth began to shake. A deep, rhythmic thunder rolled across the plains, not from the sky, but from thousands of marching feet. Villagers climbed onto rooftops. Lookouts scrambled to the tops of city walls. Mothers pulled their children indoors. In the distance, banners bearing the symbol of the god Ashur fluttered above endless columns of soldiers. The Assyrians had arrived. Unlike many ancient kingdoms that relied on farmers who fought only during times of war, the Neo-Assyrian Empire maintained one of history's first highly organized standing armies. Its soldiers trained constantly, drilled relentlessly, and were expected to be ready for campaign at a moment's notice. War was no longer a seasonal necessity. It had become a profession. Each unit had a specific role. Archers marched in disciplined ranks, unleashing deadly volleys that darkened the sky. Shield-bearers advanced beside them, protecting them from enemy arrows with towering shields. Spearmen formed solid defensive lines, while swordsmen waited for the moment to charge into the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. The army moved like a single living machine. Every soldier understood his place. Every officer knew his orders. Every movement was planned. One of Assyria's greatest advantages was its mastery of iron. While many neighboring kingdoms still depended heavily on bronze, Assyrian blacksmiths produced vast quantities of iron weapons and armor. Stronger spearheads, sharper swords, and more durable equipment gave their warriors a significant edge on the battlefield. But it wasn't just their weapons that terrified their enemies. It was their ability to break cities, once thought impossible to conquer. For centuries, massive stone walls had protected kingdoms from invading armies. Kings believed that if they could survive behind their fortifications, they could outlast any siege. The Assyrians proved them wrong. Their engineers traveled with the army, constructing massive siege ramps from earth and timber. Towering wooden siege engines rolled toward enemy walls, carrying archers who rained arrows down upon defenders. At the same time, enormous battering rams, protected beneath heavy wooden coverings soaked to resist fire, hammered relentlessly against city gates. Each crushing impact echoed across the battlefield. Boom! 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 Cracks spread through ancient walls. Gates splintered. Panic spread among the defenders. Meanwhile, Assyrian sappers dug tunnels beneath city fortifications, attempting to weaken their foundations until entire sections collapsed under their own weight. No wall seemed safe. No fortress seemed secure. The Assyrians were also among the first great empires to recognize the growing importance of cavalry. Skilled horsemen rode swiftly across the battlefield, pursuing fleeing enemies, protecting vulnerable flanks, and striking where resistance was weakest. Combined with fast-moving chariots, they gave the Assyrian army a speed few opponents could match. Even nature could not stop them. When rivers blocked their path, engineers constructed bridges or inflated animal skins to help soldiers cross the water. Mountain passes were carved into roads. Supplies followed behind the advancing army with remarkable organization, ensuring that campaigns could continue for months far from home. This level of planning stunned the ancient world. But perhaps the Assyrians' most powerful weapon required no blade, no bow, and no siege engine. It was fear. Long before the army reached a city, stories often arrived first. Stories of unstoppable soldiers. Stories of walls reduced to rubble. Stories of entire kingdoms brought to their knees. Whether every tale was true hardly mattered. The reputation alone was enough. Messengers raced into royal courts with desperate warnings. The Assyrians are coming! Some kings immediately gathered their armies. Others closed their gates and prepared for a siege. But many made a different choice. They surrendered, not because a battle had been fought, but because they believed they could never win one. That was the true genius of the Neo-Assyrian war machine. It conquered not only with iron and fire, it conquered the minds of its enemies before the first arrow was ever released. Soon, however, the empire's terrifying reputation would grow even darker. Its methods of punishment would become legendary, leaving scars on history that would endure for thousands of years. The age of conquest was giving way to the empire of fear. The Assyrian army had learned how to win battles, but the kings of Assyria understood something even more powerful. A single victory could be forgotten. A single defeat could inspire rebellion. But fear could control generations. Across the ancient Near East, the name of Assyria became a warning whispered in royal courts and crowded marketplaces. It was not enough for enemies to know that Assyria could defeat them. They needed to believe that challenging Assyria was impossible. This was the foundation of the empire's strategy. The Assyrians did not hide the brutality of their campaigns. In fact, they often made sure their enemies knew exactly what happened to those who resisted. Royal inscriptions carved into stone described military victories in great detail, recording the destruction of rebellious cities and the punishment of defeated rulers. These inscriptions were not simply historical records. They were messages. They were warnings carved into the walls of history. An enemy king who read them understood the choice before him: submit to Assyria or face the consequences. When a city rebelled, the Assyrian response could be devastating. Armies surrounded the city, cutting off food and supplies until hunger weakened the defenders. Once the walls fell, the punishment was often severe. Leaders of rebellions were targeted first. The Assyrians understood that removing those who inspired resistance was essential to maintaining control. Captured rulers were sometimes humiliated publicly, stripped of their power, and taken away as prisoners to demonstrate the absolute authority of the Assyrian king. But the most powerful tool in Assyria's expansion was not destruction. It was deportation. The Assyrians developed a systematic policy of moving large populations across their empire. Entire communities could be removed from their homeland and relocated thousands of miles away. To modern eyes, this was a horrifying practice. But for Assyria, it served several purposes. It weakened conquered nations by breaking their connection to their homeland. It reduced the chance of organized rebellion. It also allowed the empire to move skilled workers, farmers and craftsmen to regions where their abilities were needed. A population that had once fought against Assyria could be transformed into a population that helped build it. People from many different lands, languages and cultures constructed roads, cities and royal projects across the empire. The empire became a massive mixture of conquered peoples. Yet beneath the strength of Assyria's control was a constant fear. The Assyrians ruled millions of people who had not chosen to become part of the empire. Every conquered kingdom contained memories of independence. Every province was home to people who remembered their former kings and ancient traditions. The empire had to constantly prove that rebellion was hopeless. This created a cycle. A rebellion would begin. The Assyrian army would arrive. The rebellion would be crushed. Survivors would be punished or relocated. A warning would be sent to every other province. And for a time, peace would return. The Assyrians believed this was the price of order. To them, mercy toward rebels could invite chaos. A king who showed weakness risked losing everything his ancestors had built. Their brutality was not seen as cruelty by the rulers of Assyria. It was policy. It was a tool of the government. It was the foundation of their empire. But the same methods that created fear also created hatred. Behind every conquered city were thousands of people who remembered what they had lost. Behind every tribute sent to Nineveh were kingdoms waiting for a moment of weakness. For generations, fear held the empire together. But fear is a fragile foundation. Because one day, the enemies who had been forced into silence would discover something. Even the greatest empire can fall. Before that day came, however, Assyria would reach the height of its power. Its kings would build magnificent cities, fill royal palaces with unimaginable treasures, and create one of the greatest centers of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen. The empire of fear was about to become the empire of glory. When people hear the name Assyria, they often imagine only armies marching across battlefields, burning cities, and powerful kings sitting upon golden thrones. But an empire is not built by kings alone. Behind every conquest stood millions of ordinary people. The farmers who grew the food, the craftsmen who produced the weapons, the merchants who moved goods across vast distances, and the laborers who built the cities that made Assyria one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was a machine of war, but it was also a society where people lived, worked, raised families, worshipped their gods, and struggled through the challenges of everyday life. At the heart of Assyria was agriculture. The fertile lands around the Tigris River provided the foundation of the empire's strength. Farmers planted barley, wheat, fruits and vegetables while raising sheep, goats, cattle and horses. Their harvests did more than feed local communities. They supplied the massive armies that campaigned across foreign lands. Every soldier marching thousands of miles needed food. Every city needed grain. Every royal project needed workers who could be supported. Without the farmers, there could be no empire. The Assyrians developed complex systems to manage their resources. Officials recorded harvests, collected taxes, and monitored supplies through thousands of clay tablets. Nothing was left to chance. A kingdom that ruled millions of people required organization, and Assyria had one of the most advanced administrative systems of its age. Merchants also played an important role in the empire's prosperity. Trade routes connected Assyria to distant regions, bringing valuable materials such as timber, metals, precious stones and luxury goods into Assyrian cities. Markets were filled with activity. Traders negotiated prices. Craftsmen displayed their products. Workers transported goods through crowded streets. The empire's wealth flowed through these commercial networks, enriching cities and strengthening the royal treasury. But life in Assyria was not equal for everyone. Society was divided into different levels. At the top stood the king, believed to rule with the support of the god Ashur. Below him were nobles, military commanders, priests, and government officials who controlled the administration of the empire. Beneath them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, and skilled workers who formed the backbone of society. At the lowest levels were enslaved people and prisoners of war, many of whom had been captured during Assyrian campaigns. Some worked in households, while others labored on farms, construction projects, or royal monuments. Life could be harsh. The empire demanded constant labor and constant resources. Yet even ordinary people had their own traditions, families, and hopes for the future. Homes were usually built from mud brick, with courtyards that provided space for cooking, working, and family life. Wealthier families lived in larger houses with more rooms, while poorer families lived in much simpler conditions. Food was a central part of daily existence. Bread and barley products were common. People ate fruits, vegetables, dates, dairy products, and meat when available. Beer made from barley was also a common drink, enjoyed by both ordinary workers and members of the elite. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of life. The Assyrians believed their world was controlled by powerful gods who influenced everything from harvests to warfare. Temples were not only religious centers, they were also economic institutions that controlled land, wealth, and resources. Priests performed rituals and ceremonies meant to maintain harmony between humanity and the divine world. The king, more than anyone, was connected to religion. Before major military campaigns, rulers sought signs from the gods. Before making important decisions, they consulted priests and interpreters who examined omens believed to reveal the will of the divine. For the Assyrians, victory was proof that their gods favored them. Defeat meant something had gone terribly wrong. Education was another important part of Assyrian society, especially for those who entered government service. Scribes spent years learning how to read and write cuneiform, the complex writing system pressed into clay tablets. These scribes became the memory of the empire. They recorded laws. They documented trade. They preserved stories. They wrote the victories of kings that would survive thousands of years. Yet despite its incredible achievements, life inside the Neo-Assyrian Empire was shaped by one unavoidable reality. Everything existed beneath the shadow of the king and the power of the state. The empire demanded loyalty. It demanded taxes. It demanded soldiers. And when Assyria went to war, every part of society felt the impact. The farmer who grew the grain, the blacksmith who forged the weapons, the scribe who recorded the victories, the family waiting for a soldier to return home. Everyone was connected to the rise and fall of Assyria. Because behind the terrifying armies and powerful kings was something much larger. A civilization of millions of people who built, supported, and ultimately carried one of history's greatest empires. And soon the world would witness the greatest symbol of Assyrian power, the magnificent palaces, royal cities, and monuments that announced to all nations that Assyria had reached the peak of its glory. Imagine standing on a dusty road in the ancient Near East. After days of travel, a city finally appears on the horizon. Its walls seem to stretch endlessly, rising high above the surrounding plains. Massive watchtowers overlook the countryside, while banners flutter proudly from the battlements. Even from miles away, the city dominates the landscape. As you draw closer, the gates come into view. They are unlike anything you have ever seen. Guarding the entrance are colossal stone figures with the bodies of powerful bulls, the wings of mighty eagles, and the calm, bearded faces of men. These were the Lamassu, guardian spirits that symbolized strength, wisdom, and divine protection. Each statue weighed many tons. Carved from enormous blocks of stone, they were masterpieces of engineering and artistry. To every visitor, they sent an unmistakable message. You are entering the realm of the king of Assyria. For ambassadors arriving from distant kingdoms, the sight was overwhelming. Before they ever met the king, they had already witnessed his power. The Assyrians understood something that many rulers overlooked. Power was not only won on the battlefield, it had to be displayed. It had to be seen. It had to leave visitors speechless. That is why Assyrian kings poured enormous wealth into their royal capitals. One of the greatest was the city of Nimrud. Expanded into a magnificent royal center, it became a showcase of imperial glory. Grand palaces rose behind towering walls, their halls supported by massive cedar beams imported from distant forests. Floors gleamed beneath the feet of nobles, while colorful decorations adorned the interiors. Every corner proclaimed the same message: the king ruled over a world of limitless wealth. Generations later, another king would raise an even grander capital, Nineveh. Situated along the Tigris River, Nineveh grew into one of the largest and most impressive cities on earth. Its defensive walls enclosed vast neighborhoods, temples, gardens, workshops, and royal compounds. Ancient writers described it with awe. Its walls stretched for miles. Its gates were monumental. Its streets bustled with merchants, officials, soldiers, priests, and travelers from every corner of the empire. Some historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of people may have lived in and around the city during its height, making it one of the ancient world's greatest urban centers. At the heart of Nineveh stood the royal palace. Visitors entered enormous reception halls, lined with carved stone reliefs that covered the walls from floor to ceiling. These were not simple decorations. They were visual stories. Every panel celebrated Assyria's greatness. One carving showed armies storming enemy fortresses. Another depicted long columns of prisoners being led away after battle. Elsewhere, foreign kings knelt before the Assyrian ruler, presenting gold, silver, ivory, rare animals, and priceless treasures as tribute. Every image reinforced the king's authority. Every wall proclaimed victory. Among the most famous carvings were the royal lion hunts. These dramatic scenes showed the king confronting powerful lions released into specially prepared arenas. Armed with bows, spears, and chariots, he faced the charging beasts before the eyes of his court. To modern audiences, these hunts may seem like spectacles of entertainment. But to the Assyrians, they carried a deeper meaning. The lion represented chaos and untamed power. By defeating it, the king demonstrated that he alone could bring order to the world, just as he subdued rebellious kingdoms across his empire. The palaces themselves were marvels of organization. Royal scribes hurried through corridors, carrying clay tablets filled with reports from distant provinces. Military commanders discussed future campaigns. Servants prepared lavish banquets for visiting ambassadors. Musicians entertained noble guests. Priests performed sacred rituals within nearby temples. The palace was far more than a home. It was the beating heart of the empire. Every decision that affected millions of people could begin within its walls. Yet all this magnificence came at an enormous cost. Thousands of laborers worked for years to quarry stone, shape massive sculptures, transport timber across mountains, and decorate endless halls with intricate carvings. Many of these workers came from conquered lands, contributing their skills to monuments that celebrated the very empire that had defeated them. It was one of history's great ironies. The empire's greatest symbols of glory were built by people from every corner of its vast dominion. To the outside world, Assyria appeared invincible. Its cities glittered with wealth. Its palaces inspired wonder. Its kings ruled from halls that seemed worthy of the gods themselves. No one walking through the gates of Nineveh could have imagined that within a few generations, these magnificent buildings would be reduced to broken stone, buried beneath the earth. The empire stood at the height of its power. Its armies were undefeated. Its treasures were unmatched. The kings believed their glory would last forever. But the greatest rulers of Assyria were still to come. And under their command, the empire would expand farther than ever before, reaching a level of power that no kingdom in the ancient Near East had ever achieved. Empires are not remembered because they existed. They are remembered because of the men who dared to reshape history. For the Neo-Assyrian Empire, those men were kings whose ambition knew no limits. They did not simply defend their borders, they redrew the map of the ancient world. With every campaign, every siege, and every victory, they transformed Assyria from a regional kingdom into the most powerful empire the Near East had ever witnessed. But greatness always comes at a price, and every king who expanded Assyria also pushed it one step closer to its destiny. The first of these extraordinary rulers was Tiglath-Pileser III. When he took the throne in 745 BCE, the empire was in trouble. Corrupt officials enriched themselves, while distant provinces grew restless. Powerful nobles challenged the authority of the crown, and neighboring kingdoms sensed that Assyria was vulnerable. To many, it looked as though the empire's greatest days were already behind it. Tiglath-Pileser saw something different. He saw an empire that needed discipline. His reforms changed everything. He rebuilt the army into one of the most professional military forces the world had ever seen. Soldiers trained throughout the year instead of only during wartime. Conquered peoples were recruited into the ranks, creating an enormous fighting force capable of launching campaigns in every direction. He also transformed the empire's government. Instead of allowing defeated kings to remain in power, many conquered territories were placed directly under Assyrian governors, loyal only to the throne. Taxes were collected more efficiently, roads were improved, messages traveled quickly between distant provinces. For the first time, Assyria functioned like a true imperial machine. Then came the conquests. His armies swept across Syria, defeated powerful coalitions of rival kingdoms, and forced wealthy Phoenician cities to submit. One victory followed another until few rulers dared challenge Assyria openly. The empire had become unstoppable. When Tiglath-Pileser III died, he left behind a kingdom stronger than any of his predecessors could have imagined. But his successors would carry that legacy even further. Among them was Sargon II, one of the greatest military commanders Assyria ever produced. His reign began amid uncertainty, yet he quickly proved himself on the battlefield. In 722 BCE, after years of resistance, the fortified city of Samaria finally fell to Assyrian forces. The kingdom of Israel was absorbed into the empire, extending Assyria's influence farther into the western lands than ever before. Victory after victory followed. Where other kings celebrated conquest with feasts, Sargon dreamed even bigger. He ordered the construction of an entirely new royal capital, Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon. It was designed to proclaim his greatness for all eternity. Gigantic walls surrounded magnificent palaces. Towering Lamassu statues guarded the entrances. Every hall was decorated with carvings, celebrating military triumphs and the king's divine authority. It was meant to become the greatest city in the world. But fate had other plans. In 705 BCE, while leading another military campaign, Sargon II was killed in battle. His body was never recovered. For the deeply religious Assyrians, this was terrifying. A king denied a proper burial was believed to have lost the favor of the gods. His magnificent city was abandoned almost as quickly as it had been built. His dream became a ghost city. The throne then passed to his son, Sennacherib. Where his father built a new capital, Sennacherib transformed an old one. He chose Nineveh. Under his command, the city became one of the greatest urban centers on earth. Massive walls stretched for miles. Broad roads connected royal districts. Canals carried fresh water from distant mountains into the city, an engineering achievement that amazed the ancient world. His palace became a monument to imperial power. Its walls were covered with enormous stone reliefs depicting Assyrian victories in astonishing detail. Visitors did not need interpreters to understand the message. Every carving declared that resistance to Assyria was hopeless. Yet Sennacherib's greatness was measured not only by the cities he built, but by the wars he fought. His armies crushed rebellion after rebellion. They marched through mountains, deserts, and river valleys, laying siege to fortress cities that believed themselves impossible to conquer. Among these campaigns, one battle would become legendary: the Siege of Lachish. The victory was so important that Sennacherib ordered the entire battle carved into the walls of his palace, allowing future generations to witness the destruction of the city exactly as he wanted it remembered. But even kings are not safe from betrayal. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib was assassinated, killed by members of his own family. The empire was shaken once again. His son, Esarhaddon, emerged victorious after a bitter struggle for the throne. Unlike many rulers who spent years securing their power, Esarhaddon looked outward almost immediately. His ambition reached beyond anything previous Assyrian kings had attempted. Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had stood as one of the richest and most powerful civilizations on earth. Many had tried to conquer it. Few had succeeded. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian army crossed the Sinai and invaded the Nile Valley. The campaign was swift and devastating. Egyptian forces were defeated. The ancient city of Memphis fell. For the first time in history, the kings of Assyria ruled territories stretching from the mountains of Persia to the banks of the Nile. The empire had reached an unimaginable size, yet its greatest ruler was still to come. His name was Ashurbanipal. Unlike most warrior kings, Ashurbanipal possessed two extraordinary talents. He could command an army, and he could read. At a time when literacy among kings was rare, Ashurbanipal mastered the difficult cuneiform script. He studied history, religion, medicine, astronomy, and literature with the same determination that he devoted to warfare. But no one should mistake his education for weakness. His campaigns against Elam were among the most destructive in Assyrian history. Enemy cities were captured one after another until the once powerful kingdom ceased to threaten Assyria forever. At the same time, Nineveh reached the peak of its glory. Tributes poured into the capital from every province: gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, exotic animals, luxury goods from every corner of the empire. The wealth seemed endless. Yet Ashurbanipal understood something his predecessors had not. Empires could conquer kingdoms, but knowledge could conquer time. He ordered scribes to gather every important text they could find: ancient myths, religious hymns, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, royal records. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets filled the shelves of his great library. When Nineveh was eventually destroyed, many of those tablets were buried beneath the ruins, protected by the very fires that consumed the city. More than 2,000 years later, archaeologists would uncover them, allowing the voices of ancient Mesopotamia to speak once again. It was one of history's greatest ironies. The empire remembered for its armies also became the empire that preserved some of humanity's oldest written knowledge. Under Ashurbanipal, Assyria stood at the very peak of its power. Its armies were undefeated. Its cities were magnificent. Its wealth was beyond imagination. From the outside, it appeared eternal. But beneath the glory, unseen cracks were beginning to spread. The greatest empire the ancient world had ever known was standing at the edge of a cliff, and it did not yet realize the fall had already begun. The year was 701 BCE. Dust filled the air as tens of thousands of Assyrian soldiers marched across the hills of the ancient kingdom of Judah. Their destination was a heavily fortified city that stood between them and complete domination of the region. Its name was Lachish. Only Jerusalem was more important. Perched on a high hill and protected by massive stone walls, Lachish had long been considered one of Judah's strongest fortresses. Anyone hoping to conquer the kingdom would first have to break its defenses. King Hezekiah of Judah had rebelled against Assyrian rule, refusing to continue paying tribute to the empire. It was a dangerous gamble. For years, smaller kingdoms had watched Assyria grow stronger, wondering if anyone could resist its seemingly unstoppable advance. Hezekiah believed the moment had come. He was wrong. When news of the rebellion reached King Sennacherib, his response was swift. The Assyrian war machine began to move. Thousands of infantry marched in disciplined formations. Cavalry rode ahead to scout the countryside. Supply wagons stretched for miles, carrying food, weapons, timber, and the equipment needed to wage a prolonged siege. Where the Assyrians marched, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Village after village surrendered without resistance. Those that refused were overwhelmed. Soon, the black banners of Assyria appeared outside the walls of Lachish. The defenders looked down from the battlements and saw an army unlike anything they had ever faced. The siege began immediately. Assyrian engineers surveyed the landscape, searching for the weakest point in the city's defenses. Then, thousands of laborers, many from conquered peoples within the empire, began hauling stones, earth, and timber toward the walls. Day after day, night after night, they built an enormous siege ramp. It grew higher with each passing hour, slowly climbing toward the city's walls like a man-made mountain. From above, the defenders fired arrows, hurled stones, and threw burning torches in desperate attempts to stop the construction. But the work never stopped. Whenever one laborer fell, another took his place. The Assyrians simply kept building. At the top of the ramp, massive battering rams rolled forward beneath protective wooden coverings. Iron-tipped beams slammed against the walls again and again. Boom, boom, boom. Each impact echoed across the valley. Meanwhile, Assyrian archers unleashed relentless volleys, forcing the defenders to take cover while elite soldiers advanced closer to the walls. Smoke filled the sky. The cries of wounded men echoed through the city. Families huddled inside their homes, listening as the walls that had protected generations slowly began to fail. Then came the moment everyone feared. A section of the defenses gave way. Assyrian warriors surged through the breach. The battle turned into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Swords clashed, spears shattered, shields splintered. The narrow streets became scenes of desperate fighting as the defenders struggled to hold back the invading army. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. The city's resistance collapsed. Lachish had fallen. For its people, the consequences were devastating. Many survivors were taken into captivity, while others were relocated elsewhere within the empire as part of Assyria's long-standing policy of deportation. Vast amounts of treasure, livestock, and supplies were seized as tribute for the Assyrian king. For Sennacherib, the victory was more than another conquered city. It was a statement. He wanted the entire ancient world to witness what happened to those who challenged Assyria. When he returned to Nineveh, he ordered artists to carve the entire siege into enormous stone reliefs, decorating the walls of his palace. The carving showed Assyrian soldiers storming the city, battering rams smashing the walls, archers filling the sky with arrows, prisoners marching into captivity. The king sat proudly upon his throne, receiving the spoils of victory. These reliefs still exist today. More than 2,700 years later, they provide one of the most detailed visual records of ancient warfare ever discovered. Unlike many battles lost to history, the siege of Lachish can still be seen almost exactly as Assyrian artists wanted the world to remember it. It was not simply a military victory, it was propaganda carved in stone. Yet despite the triumph at Lachish, one city remained unconquered: Jerusalem. For reasons still debated by historians, including disease, logistical challenges, and the biblical account, the Assyrians did not capture the city during Sennacherib's campaign. It was one of the few places to withstand complete conquest. Still, the victory at Lachish reinforced a terrifying truth. No fortress was truly safe. No walls were high enough. No kingdom was beyond the reach of Assyria. At the beginning of the 7th century BCE, the empire stood at the height of its military power. Its enemies feared it. Its allies obeyed it. The kings believed their dominion would last forever. But history has a way of humbling even the mightiest empires. And while Assyria celebrated its victories, the seeds of its destruction were already taking root. History remembers the Neo-Assyrian Empire as a civilization of warriors. It remembers the thunder of marching armies, the collapse of fortified cities, the kings who ruled through overwhelming power. But hidden behind the walls of Nineveh stood a treasure far greater than gold, silver, or conquered kingdoms. It was a treasure that no army could forge with iron, no king could seize with a sword. A treasure made entirely of words. While soldiers were expanding the empire across the ancient world, another mission was unfolding inside the royal palace. Its purpose was not to conquer nations. Its purpose was to conquer time. The architect of that mission was the last great king of Assyria, Ashurbanipal. Unlike most rulers of the ancient world, Ashurbanipal was exceptionally educated. He took great pride in being able to read and write cuneiform, the complex script used throughout Mesopotamia. In an age when many kings relied almost entirely on scribes to interpret written records, Ashurbanipal studied ancient texts himself. To him, knowledge was another form of power. He understood something that few rulers had ever considered. Cities could be destroyed. Palaces could burn, empires could disappear, but if knowledge survived, a civilization could never truly die. So Ashurbanipal began one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in ancient history. He ordered his officials and scribes to search every corner of Mesopotamia for important texts. They traveled to ancient temples. They entered schools where scribes had worked for generations. They visited royal archives belonging to older kingdoms. Everywhere they went, they searched for wisdom. When valuable tablets were discovered, they were carefully copied or sent directly to Nineveh. The collection grew year after year. Thousands of clay tablets filled room after room inside the royal palace. Each one represented countless hours of patient work. Scribes sat quietly with sharpened reed styluses pressed between their fingers, carefully imprinting tiny, wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay. One mistake could change an entire sentence. One missing symbol could alter the meaning of history. Precision was everything. The library eventually became the greatest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world. Its shelves contained royal records describing the rise and fall of kings. Legal documents settled disputes over land, trade, and inheritance. Medical texts described illnesses, surgical procedures, and herbal remedies used by physicians. Astronomers recorded eclipses, planetary movements, and the changing night sky with astonishing accuracy for their time. Religious hymns preserved ceremonies performed for centuries inside Mesopotamian temples. Every tablet represented another piece of humanity's memory. But among all these priceless writings, one story stood above the rest. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Long before Homer composed the Iliad or the Odyssey, scribes had already written the adventures of Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk. It was a story of friendship, of loss, of fear, of humanity's endless search for immortality. After the death of his closest companion, Gilgamesh wandered across the world seeking a way to escape death itself. He crossed dangerous mountains. He challenged terrifying creatures. He searched for eternal life, only to discover the one truth every ruler must eventually face. No king lives forever. Only their legacy remains. Perhaps that lesson resonated deeply with Ashurbanipal. Perhaps he understood that one day even his own empire would fade. If so, he made certain that its knowledge would endure long after its armies had vanished. Ironically, the library faced the same danger as the empire it served. War. Not long after Ashurbanipal's death, powerful enemies surrounded Nineveh. The city that had once ruled the Near East became the target of a devastating siege. Flames swept through magnificent palaces. Wooden roofs collapsed into roaring fires. Walls cracked beneath relentless attacks. The empire itself was dying. Inside the royal library, thousands of clay tablets crashed from shattered shelves onto stone floors. It seemed certain that centuries of knowledge would disappear forever. But then something extraordinary happened. The intense heat from the burning buildings baked many of the clay tablets, turning the soft clay into hard ceramic. The very fire that destroyed the palace helped preserve its contents. Buried beneath layers of ash, rubble, and collapsed walls, the tablets slept undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. Empires rose, empires fell. Generations came and went. The world changed beyond recognition. Then in the 19th century, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Nineveh. As they dug deeper into the ancient debris, they made one of the greatest discoveries in archaeological history. Thousands of remarkably preserved clay tablets emerged from the earth. Many could still be read. The voices of ancient Mesopotamia began to speak once more. Through those forgotten writings, historians recovered lost myths, scientific observations, royal chronicles, religious beliefs, medical knowledge, and some of the oldest literature ever created. Without Ashurbanipal's library, much of the ancient Near East would remain a mystery. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The empire that terrified the world with its armies ultimately gave humanity one of its greatest gifts. Not another conquest, not another victory, but the survival of civilization's memory. Yet while the library preserved the words of Assyria, it could not preserve the empire itself. Beyond the walls of Nineveh, old enemies were growing stronger. The kings who once bowed before Assyria were beginning to dream of revenge. The greatest empire of the ancient world had reached the height of its glory, and without realizing it, it was standing on the edge of collapse. There was a time when no king in the ancient world dared ignore a message from Assyria. When an Assyrian envoy arrived at a royal court, every eye turned toward him. The scroll he carried might contain a demand for tribute, an order from the king, or a warning that an army was already on the march. For many rulers, there was only one sensible response: obey. By the middle of the 7th century BCE, under the reign of Ashurbanipal, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had reached the absolute height of its power. Never before had an empire in the ancient Near East controlled so much territory under a single government, from the rugged mountains of the east to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, from the forests of Anatolia to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, and as far southwest as Egypt. The empire stretched across thousands of miles. Within its borders lived millions of people. They spoke different languages. They worshipped different gods. They followed different customs. Yet all of them answered to one throne, the throne of Assyria. Keeping such a vast empire under control required far more than powerful armies. It required organization unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials appointed by the king. Their responsibilities were clear: collect taxes, maintain order, oversee local administration, and report directly to Nineveh. Nothing escaped the king's attention for long. Messengers traveled along a network of royal roads, carrying reports between distant provinces and the capital. Fresh horses waited at stations along the routes, allowing urgent news to travel with remarkable speed. A rebellion on one frontier, a drought in another province, a military victory hundreds of miles away. Within days or weeks, the information could reach the royal court. This flow of information gave Assyria a tremendous advantage over its rivals. The empire also became one of the wealthiest civilizations of its time. Every year, tribute poured into Nineveh from conquered lands. Gold from distant kingdoms, silver from mountain mines, pine, cedar timber from Lebanon, ivory from Africa, horses from the northern plains, rare stones, colorful textiles, spices, exotic animals, and countless other treasures arrived from every direction. The wealth seemed endless. Caravans entered the capital one after another, loaded with the riches of dozens of nations. To visitors, Nineveh appeared almost beyond imagination. Its markets overflowed with goods from lands they had never seen. Its temples towered above crowded streets. Its workshops rang with the sound of craftsmen shaping metal, carving stone, and weaving magnificent fabrics. The city was the beating heart of an empire that connected cultures from across the ancient world. Yet the empire's greatest strength remained its army. At almost any moment, Assyrian forces could be found campaigning somewhere along the frontier. One army crushed a rebellion in the east. Another secured trade routes in the west. A third guarded the borders of Egypt. The empire rarely knew peace. Victory had become a necessity. Every successful campaign brought fresh tribute and reinforced the belief that Assyria could never be defeated. The empire's reputation became so overwhelming that some rulers surrendered before a single battle was fought. Why sacrifice an army? Why destroy a city when the outcome already seemed inevitable? Fear continued to accomplish what swords alone could not. Yet beneath this extraordinary success, dangerous problems were beginning to emerge. The empire had become enormous, perhaps too enormous. Its armies were constantly deployed across distant frontiers. Its governors ruled lands separated by deserts, rivers, and mountains. Every new conquest added more people to govern, more roads to defend, more soldiers to supply, more rebellions to suppress. The machine that had once expanded so efficiently was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. At the same time, the subject peoples had not forgotten who they were. Babylonians still remembered Babylon. The Egyptians longed for independence. The Medes were growing stronger in the east, and beyond the empire's borders, ambitious rulers carefully studied Assyria's strengths, searching for its weaknesses. For decades, the empire's immense power concealed these growing cracks. To the outside world, Assyria still appeared invincible. The kings ruled from magnificent palaces. Its armies marched without equal. Its treasuries overflowed with unimaginable wealth. No one could imagine that this mighty empire, whose shadow stretched across the ancient world, would soon begin to unravel with astonishing speed. History has shown time and again that the larger an empire grows, the more difficult it becomes to hold together. And for Assyria, the first signs of collapse were already beginning to appear. The empire had reached the summit of its greatness. From this moment forward, there was only one direction left to go. At its peak, the Neo-Assyrian Empire seemed eternal. Its armies had conquered kingdoms from the mountains of the east to the banks of the Nile. Its kings ruled over millions of people. Its cities overflowed with wealth, and its enemies trembled at the mere mention of its name. To the world, Assyria appeared indestructible. But history often hides the first signs of collapse beneath the brilliance of success. The beginning of the end did not come with a massive invasion. It began quietly. It began from within. In 631 BCE, King Ashurbanipal died. The man who had led Assyria to its greatest height was gone. His death created a void that no one could easily fill. Unlike his powerful predecessors, the rulers who followed struggled to maintain control over the enormous empire. Rival princes competed for the throne. Powerful nobles sought greater influence. Provincial governors began acting with increasing independence. The unity that had held the empire together for centuries slowly began to fracture. Soon, whispers of unrest became open rebellion. Far from Nineveh, subject kingdoms sensed weakness for the first time in generations. The Babylonians, who had long resented Assyrian domination, saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence. Their ancient city had endured repeated conflicts with Assyria, and its people had never forgotten the humiliation of foreign rule. To the east, another power was rising, the Medes. Once divided into scattered tribes, they were becoming a formidable kingdom under strong leadership. They had watched Assyria conquer the world. Now they prepared to challenge it. Meanwhile, the Assyrian army faced an impossible burden. Its soldiers were expected to defend thousands of miles of frontier. They were dispatched to suppress rebellions in one province, only to learn that another revolt had erupted hundreds of miles away. Victory after victory had stretched the empire to its limits. Now those vast borders had become a weakness. Maintaining such an enormous empire required constant resources. Taxes grew heavier. Campaigns became more frequent. Communities that had once accepted Assyrian rule began to resist. Even loyal provinces grew weary of endless demands for soldiers, supplies, and tribute. The empire that had once inspired fear was now beginning to inspire resentment. Then came the alliance that would change history. In 626 BCE, the Babylonian noble Nabopolassar led a successful revolt and declared himself king of a newly independent Babylon. For Assyria, this was more than another rebellion. It was a direct challenge to imperial authority. The Assyrians fought desperately to regain control, but the balance of power had shifted. Nabopolassar found a powerful ally in the Medes, led by King Sennacherib. For generations, Assyria had defeated its enemies one by one. Now, for the first time in decades, its greatest rivals stood united. Babylonians, Medes, and eventually, other people who had suffered under Assyrian rule joined the growing coalition. Old enemies became allies. Old grudges became a common cause. The empire that had spent centuries dividing its opponents now faced a united front. Inside Assyria, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Royal authority weakened. Political instability spread. The army, once unmatched, was forced to fight on multiple fronts at once. Every victory came at a greater cost. Every defeat encouraged new rebellions. The empire was bleeding strength. Yet the kings of Assyria refused to surrender. They believed the empire that had ruled the ancient world for 3 centuries could survive this crisis. After all, had they not overcome impossible odds before? Had their armies not crushed every rival that stood against them? Surely they could do so again. But this time was different. The enemies outside the empire had grown stronger. The divisions inside the empire had grown deeper. For the first time in its history, Assyria was no longer controlling events. It was reacting to them. The unstoppable war machine was beginning to slow. The empire of fear had discovered something it had made countless others experience: uncertainty. Soon, the greatest city in the ancient world would find itself surrounded. The mighty walls of Nineveh, once believed impossible to breach, would face an enemy determined to erase Assyria forever. The final chapter of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was about to begin. For more than 3 centuries, the kings of Assyria had watched enemy cities burn from the safety of their thrones. Now, history had turned against them. The year was 612 BCE. Beyond the towering walls of Nineveh, a massive coalition of enemies gathered for one final assault. The Babylonians, led by King Nabopolassar, marched beside the Medes under King Cyaxares. They were joined by other people who had lived for generations under Assyrian domination. Many had once feared Assyria. Now they had come to destroy it. Before them stood one of the greatest cities on earth. Nineveh was no ordinary capital. Its enormous defensive walls stretched for nearly 12 kilometers, about 7.5 miles, and were reinforced with massive stone foundations and guarded by imposing towers. Behind them stood magnificent palaces, temples, libraries, gardens, workshops, and homes crowded with hundreds of thousands of people. For generations, Nineveh had symbolized power. Now it had become a fortress under siege. Inside the city, fear replaced confidence. The people who had once celebrated endless victories now watched from the battlements as enemy campfires spread across the horizon. Every direction they looked, there were enemies. The siege began. The coalition surrounded Nineveh, cutting off supplies and isolating the city from the rest of the empire. Day after day, attacks tested the city's defenses. Archers exchanged volleys. Siege engines rolled toward the walls. The defenders fought desperately, determined to protect the capital that had ruled the ancient world. But this was not the same Assyria that had conquered countless kingdoms. Years of civil war, rebellion, and constant campaigning had exhausted the empire. Its armies were stretched thin. Its resources were dwindling. Its confidence was fading. As the weeks passed, the pressure grew unbearable. Then, according to ancient Babylonian chronicles, nature itself may have turned against Nineveh. Heavy rains caused the nearby Kosa River to flood, weakening part of the city's defenses. Ancient accounts suggest that sections of the walls collapsed, creating an opening the attackers had been waiting for. Whether by flood, relentless assault, or a combination of both, the result was catastrophic. The coalition surged through the breach. The battle for Nineveh had begun. Chaos consumed the city. The disciplined order that had once defined the Assyrian Empire disappeared beneath clouds of smoke and dust. Soldiers fought desperately through narrow streets. Citizens fled in every direction. Temples echoed with cries of panic. Magnificent palaces that had stood for generations became battlefields. Fire spread rapidly. Wooden roofs collapsed. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, many believed the Neo-Assyrian Empire had come to an end. They were wrong. An empire that had ruled the ancient world for more than 3 centuries would not disappear in a single night. The survivors refused to surrender. Amid the ruins of their shattered capital, Assyrian nobles, soldiers, and officials gathered what remained of their strength. Escaping the destruction, they fled westward, determined to continue the fight. Their new refuge was the fortified city of Harran. There a new king emerged, Ashurbanipal. He claimed the ancient throne of Assyria and declared that the empire still lived. Though Nineveh had fallen, the Assyrian spirit had not. But the reality was grim. The vast imperial bureaucracy was gone. The royal palaces were ashes. Many of the empire's greatest cities had either fallen or been abandoned. The once invincible army had been reduced to scattered survivors. For the first time in generations, Assyria was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted. Yet hope arrived from an unexpected ally, Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh understood that if Babylon and the Medes completely destroyed Assyria, they would become the dominant power in the Near East. To prevent that, Egypt chose to support its former enemy. It was one of history's most unlikely alliances. For centuries, Assyria and Egypt had fought bitter wars. Now they stood side by side, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Together, the remaining Assyrian forces and the Egyptian army prepared to defend Harran. In 610 BCE, however, the Babylonians and the Medes advanced once again. The attack was swift. The defenders fought with the courage of men who knew they had nowhere left to retreat. But courage alone could not rebuild an empire. Harran fell. Ashurbanipal II attempted to retake the city with Egyptian support the following year, but the effort failed. The last Assyrian capital was lost forever. From that moment on, the Neo-Assyrian Empire effectively ceased to exist as a functioning state. Yet one final confrontation still awaited. The Babylonians knew Egypt would not give up easily. The Egyptians knew Babylon intended to drive them from the region. The stage was set for a battle that would decide the future of the ancient Near East. The place was Carchemish. The year was 605 BCE. On the banks of the Euphrates River, 2 great armies faced one another. On one side stood the combined forces of Egypt and the remaining Assyrian soldiers, veterans fighting not only for victory, but for the memory of their fallen empire. On the other stood the Babylonian army, commanded by a brilliant young prince. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. The battle was fierce. Spears collided, arrows darkened the sky. War chariots thundered across the plain. The surviving Assyrians fought with desperate determination, knowing this was their last chance to reclaim even a fragment of what they had lost. But the years of defeat had taken their toll. The Babylonian army broke through the Allied lines. Panic spread across the battlefield. The Egyptian forces began to retreat. The remaining Assyrian soldiers were overwhelmed. When the fighting ended, there was no empire left to defend. Carchemish marked the final chapter of Assyria's military history. After more than 300 years of expansion, conquest and domination, the Neo-Assyrian Empire vanished from the political map of the ancient world. The cities that had once commanded continents fell silent. The royal dynasty disappeared. The armies that had terrified generations were gone. Babylon inherited much of Assyria's territory. Soon, Babylon itself would become the dominant power of the Near East. It was a cruel twist of history. The empire that had conquered countless kingdoms ultimately conquered itself. The rulers, who had believed their reign would last forever, discovered the same truth that every empire eventually learns. No power is eternal. No kingdom is invincible. No empire escapes time. And yet, although Assyria disappeared as a nation, it refused to disappear from history. Its military innovations would influence future empires. Its administrative systems would inspire later rulers. Its monuments would astonish archaeologists thousands of years later. And the clay tablets buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh would preserve the voices of an ancient civilization long after its kings, armies and cities had turned to dust. Assyria was gone, But its legacy had only just begun. The empire was gone. Its palaces had collapsed into ruins. Its kings had vanished from history. The roar of its armies had faded into silence. For centuries, wind swept across the broken walls of Nineveh. Sand buried magnificent sculptures. Grass grew over roads once traveled by conquering armies. The world moved on, and new empires rose where Assyria had once ruled. It seemed as though one of history's greatest civilizations had been erased forever. But history has a remarkable way of preserving the past, even when the past believes it has been forgotten. Centuries turned into millennia. The names of Assyrian kings survived only in scattered traditions and ancient texts. Travelers passed mysterious mounds of earth in northern Mesopotamia, unaware that beneath their feet lay the remains of one of the greatest cities the world had ever known. Then in the 19th century, archaeologists began excavating those ancient mounds. What they discovered astonished the world. Colossal Lamassu statues emerged from the soil, almost exactly where Assyrian kings had placed them more than 2,000 years earlier. Palace walls revealed intricate carvings of battles, royal ceremonies, lion hunts, and foreign ambassadors bringing tribute to the empire. The ruins of Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Ashur slowly came back into the light. Every excavation uncovered another piece of a forgotten civilization. Then came one of archaeology's greatest discoveries, thousands of clay tablets from Ashurbanipal's library. For over 2,000 years, they had rested beneath collapsed buildings, protected by the very destruction that had consumed the city. When scholars began translating them, the ancient world found its voice again. Royal chronicles described the rise of kings. Medical texts revealed how physicians treated disease. Astronomical observations showed how carefully Mesopotamian scholars studied the heavens. Religious hymns preserved beliefs that had nearly vanished from memory. Ancient literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, returned to humanity after being lost for centuries. Without those tablets, much of early Mesopotamian history would remain unknown. Yet Assyria's influence extends far beyond archaeology. Its military changed warfare forever. The Assyrians developed one of the first permanent professional armies in history. They perfected large-scale siege warfare. They integrated infantry, cavalry, engineers, and logistics into coordinated military campaigns that later empires would study and imitate. The idea that an empire should maintain a standing army, capable of fighting year-round rather than relying solely on temporary levies, became a model for many civilizations that followed. Assyria also transformed government. Ruling millions of people across enormous distances required organization, communication, and administration on a scale few societies had attempted before. Provincial governors answered directly to the king. Royal roads connected distant territories. Messengers carried information across the empire with remarkable speed. Detailed records tracked taxes, resources, military campaigns, and the movement of goods. These systems demonstrated that an empire could be held together not only by force, but also by efficient administration. Later powers, including the Babylonians, Persians, and others, would build upon many of these ideas. Of course, Assyria's legacy is also inseparable from its reputation for harsh rule. Its royal inscriptions celebrated military victories and severe punishments, contributing to an enduring image of the empire as exceptionally formidable. Modern historians note that many of these inscriptions also served as royal propaganda, intended to intimidate enemies and glorify the king. While Assyria could be ruthless, it was also a complex civilization of administrators, builders, scholars, artisans, merchants, farmers, and scribes. Its story cannot be reduced to conquest alone. That complexity is what makes Assyria so fascinating. It was an empire capable of destroying cities and preserving humanity's oldest stories. An empire that inspired terror, yet produced extraordinary works of art. An empire that conquered nations, yet helped safeguard the knowledge of civilizations that came before it. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Neo-Assyrian Empire leaves behind. Power can build magnificent cities. Power can command vast armies. Power can force kings to kneel, but power alone cannot defeat time. Even the mightiest empire will one day face its final sunset. The walls will crumble, the banners will fall, the armies will disappear. What endures is not the empire itself, but the legacy it leaves behind. Today, the ruins of Nineveh stand as silent witnesses to a civilization that once believed it would rule forever. The carved stones no longer proclaim victory to frightened ambassadors. The royal palaces no longer echo with the footsteps of kings. The war drums have fallen silent, yet through archaeology, through history, and through the words pressed into clay more than 2,700 years ago, the Neo-Assyrian Empire still speaks. It reminds us that every civilization, no matter how powerful, is temporary. But knowledge, memory, and history can outlive even the greatest empire. And so the story of Assyria does not truly end with the fall of Nineveh. It continues every time we uncover another artifact, translate another tablet, or remember the empire that once stood at the center of the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian Empire fell in 609 BCE. Its legacy never did.